In 1593, while war was raging on the Korean peninsula, the new shogun of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, would pass a decree related to this Imjin War against Korea. He sent a letter to his daimyo and their samurai requesting that the artisans and scholars of Korea be brought to him. The Imjin War would then turn into not just a struggle for Korea's land and its wealth, but for the very mind of Korea itself, as some of its greatest artisans and scholars would be abducted and taken back to those hostile lands. This is a dramatic moment, quite traumatic for both China and Korea, and part of the broader trauma of the Sengoku Jidai era in Japan itself. But there's also a beauty that emerged from it. Many of these Korean artisans were potters, very skilled and technically capable, and when they came to Japan, they invented some incredibly beautiful and influential pieces of art that still impact the modern world of ceramics in Japan and in the broader world. But we never really hear the story of these craftsmen and their artistry. So today, I'm going to be talking about the broader history of the fall of the Ming Dynasty in China, the Imjin Wars, and the Sengoku Jidai. But I'm going to be talking about it through the context of ceramics, and in particular, the Korean potters who would settle in Japan after these wars and go on to make these works of art. So, hi all, welcome back to Ground Up History, and I am not Yi-sam Pyong. So if you couldn't tell by my pronunciation, I don't speak Korean or Japanese, so apologies in advance. I'm going to try these pronunciations, but I'm probably not going to do great, so sorry. So to tell the story of Korean ceramics in Japan, we actually need to begin a lot earlier than any of this war or chaos. See, for a very long time, before the Sengoku Jidai began in 1467, there had been an increasing market for importing ceramics into Japan to feed things like the tea ceremony. In fact, the Ashikaga shogunate had a very large collection of tea bowls and other ceremonial ceramic items that it used in very important ceremonies within Japan that were used as part of the enforcement of the hierarchy and feudal structure of Japan in this time. A lot of these ceramics were being imported from China, which produced some of the finest ceramics in the world. They invented porcelain. Some of it was also imported from Korea, but Korean ceramics were more minimalist. See, a lot of Chinese styles emphasized things like blue glazes and beautiful sort of patterned pots, but Korea at this point had more of an emphasis on minimalism. There was a sort of idea in its faith and general practice that beauty should not be emphasized. So a lot of Korean ceramics was much more focused on the day-to-day functional use of ceramics, so it wasn't necessarily as preferred for export markets into Japan, although it did still happen. Over the course of the Ashikaga's downfall, when the Sengoku Jidai began, they actually would sell off a lot of these tea ceremony bowls to various families to fund their war effort, which meant that there was sort of this spread of famous shogunal ceremonial pots across the nation. And there's actually some evidence that Toyotomi Hideyoshi would even spare families if they gave him the ceramic bowls that used to be gone to the Ashikaga. So there's kind of this interesting association with these kind of tea bowls and power within Japan itself. So much so that the kidnapping of Korean potters would lead to some to refer to the Imjin War as the Tea Bowl War, rather than, its more classical name, simply because of how important tea bowls were culturally to medieval Japan, and in particular the samurai. So, over the course of the Sengoku Jidai, obviously, many people died, there was a huge amount of chaos. Oda Nobunaga rose and was betrayed. Hideyoshi Toyotomi rose, and he found himself at the helm of a nation that was full of very experienced, very opportunistic armies. And while he tenuously controlled it, he knew that loyalty was cheap. So he directed these armies at Korea, trying to unify the nation through finding an external enemy. It would ultimately be disastrous for him and for everyone. The Imjin War, lasting from 1592 to 1598, was devastating. Probably over 1 million Korean civilians died, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers from both sides. Eventually, the Chinese would intervene under the Ming Dynasty and support Korea. Japan was pushed out, but much of Korea was devastated. Right after the war, there was a brutal famine, and many of its skilled artisans and scholars, which the relatively peaceful Kingdom of Korea had enjoyed the fruits of before this invasion, had now been kidnapped away to Japan. There's a kind of interesting dynamic that would happen then. In the result of the Imjin War, Toyotomi Hideyoshi would ultimately be overthrown, not solely because of that, but he would then be replaced by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would begin the period of semi-isolationism known as the Edo period, a kind of relatively peaceful time for Japan where it turned inwards, and a lot of this sort of violence and chaos would then become synonymous with art and poetry and wealth. On the other side, the Ming Dynasty would fall and be replaced by the Qing after a brutal series of invasions by the Manchu, and Korea itself would further be devastated by an invasion of the Manchus as well in 1637. These two devastating invasions and then subjugation by the Qing would leave Korea much diminished from its pre-invasion heights. But many of these Korean potters would find new hope in Japan, despite the fact that they had been kidnapped. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting that Japan was nice for kidnapping them or that it was something that they wanted. In fact, there's actually art pieces describing how much those Koreans wanted to go home but couldn't. But they didn't lose their identities. This is one of the more interesting parts of it. Some of these Korean potters maintained the use of their language, maintained their cultural practices, their style of dress, and in fact actually gained quite significant status within Japan. Some of these potters and their kilns are still influential to this day in Japan, and their Korean identities are not solely erased, although certainly minimized. So, while I do point out that these Korean potters found success and were given honors in Japan, let's be clear, Japan kidnapped these people, and it was the invasion of Korea which led to them having greater opportunities in Japan than they would have had in their own home country. That doesn't mean that they necessarily wanted to be brought to Japan. Most of these Korean potters would actually end up in the island of Kyushu, serving under the daimyo of some of the domains that were influential in the region. Most notably likely the Saga and the Shimazu, as under the Saga, the famous guy I mentioned at the start, Yi Sampyeong, would discover near a town called Arita white clay and produce the first porcelain in Japan. His production of this resource was likely the first ever. Now, that is somewhat contested, but at the very least, his Arita ware was so influential on Japanese art, and in particular Japanese porcelain, that I think it's reasonable to say he functionally invented a new art form in Japan either way, if he wasn't necessarily the very first to do it, although he very well may have been. In Arita, his kilns would produce thousands of some of the finest pieces of porcelain that the Japanese could get their hands on, particularly because the chaos in the mainland had led to the Chinese no longer being able to export porcelain to Japan in the same way they had prior, and neither the Koreans. So the production of this domestic porcelain proved vital to the new sort of elevated importance of tea culture in Japan. See, as the Edo period began and the Sengoku Jidai ended, many of these samurai and daimyo kept their hierarchical positions, but they still needed to maintain that through their traditional markers of power, and they couldn't do that anymore through martial means. Over the past almost 200 years, all of these figures had gained power through great feats of strength or military campaigning, and that just wasn't how you did things anymore. So the tea ceremony and other traditions would become vital to the practice of Japanese hierarchy. This was so important that many daimyo, when they visited the shogun every year, would try to have the best gifts possible to bring. So having something like the Arita kilns that the saga had access to was in fact so important. They had samurai on guard to keep its secrets from getting out, and even gave those Korean potters the right to carry swords themselves. A huge honor, essentially exclusive to the samurai. Now, that's not to say these Korean artists were given samurai status, but the fact that they were given essentially an equivalent power is pretty astounding. It definitely speaks to the influence and importance they had to their daimyo. As well, the samurai themselves had ceased to be warriors so much and had begun to move into more of an administrative role across Japan. So many samurai began their own collection of pottery as well for the tea ceremony, as again, these ceremonies and traditions were a means of demonstrating their traditional worth and the importance of their role within the hierarchy of feudal Japan. Even merchants would start collecting ceramics as well for tea ceremony as they started to gain more wealth and power but wanted to move up in social status. So ceramics were very symbolic of power for the Japanese, and these Korean potters could fill multiple demands. While Arita ware filled a demand for porcelain that wasn't met, in Satsuma in southern Kyushu, other Korean potters filled a different niche. See, Satsuma ware is more influenced with texture and rugged colors rather than the kind of clean white and glazed porcelain that was being produced in the north of Kyushu. This Satsuma ware would also become very popular as many in Japan appreciated the aesthetic, the texture, the feel, and many samurai in fact actually were drawn to a more rustic form of ceramic, as they still viewed themselves as kind of rustic, minimalist, and martial people despite moving into a more administrative role. So this style of pottery very much appealed to them. And it was a style of pottery very much brought in from Korea itself. Again, Korea had had a huge emphasis on minimalism and form over function. But this Japanese artist allowed these Korean potters, who in Korea had been low-class artisans making daily stoneware, to now produce pieces of art that simply drew inspiration from the artistic values of their culture to a very appreciative market in Japan. It made them, again, wealthy and powerful. There's even actually some interesting examples of Japanese porcelain being used to make maps, which is a super cool usage of the art, and again, carries a lot of symbolic meaning when you think about how maps are used to signify power, status, and your control over a territory. And within the culture of Japan, this porcelain and these ceramics more broadly had also become a source of conspicuous consumption, representing the status, power, and hierarchy of the martial classes of the Japanese feudal system. It's especially interesting as well when you add on top of that the layer of European consumption of these porcelains, as by creating a porcelain map of Japan, you're claiming ownership for potentially a foreign market of the art and the porcelain as Japanese, when in fact it was created here by a Korean, refined and designed. A lot of interesting dynamics at play. As these Korean potters gained more influence and importance within the domains that their daimyo had brought them to, they also began to produce more variety of styles. Nabeshima ware became known in Arita. Takatori ware was from a neighboring prefecture. In the south, there was even a town called Neshirogawa, which had a uniquely Korean identity preserved. In fact, the Shimazu lords of that domain likely actually enforced the protection and preservation of the Korean identity of those townsfolk because of how valuable the Satsuma ware that they produced was to those daimyo. But they didn't just produce fine porcelains or ceramics for this kind of conspicuous consumption market. They brought with them a lot of technique and technology as well, which allowed them to much more easily mass-produce ceramics. They brought in the climbing kiln, which was essentially a heat source with many different sections that allowed for much more to be produced in one go, and those were used in places like Hizen and across Japan. The climbing kiln allowing for a greater level of mass production didn't just help feed the production of thousands of pieces of fine porcelain, but also daily consumption goods like stoneware for Japanese households, or roof tiles, or storage vessels. Things that had been the primary function of these Korean potters back in Korea. Although now the dynamics had kind of changed, the Koreans found themselves in a position of elevated status where their knowledge and skills as artisans had earned them great honors. The right to carry swords in this period, of course, was incredibly meaningful in medieval Japan. It was equivalent to samurai in some ways, although they likely weren't actually samurai. I know people are going to get weird about that. But the sort of daily mass-produced goods were being produced in many cases by Japanese potters. So there's kind of this change in the power dynamic between these Koreans and the Japanese who were learning from them. As well, the Koreans would bring techniques for better stacking pottery, different tools that made its production more efficient, and different styles that created more variety. As Japan grew wealthier and security led to a rising middle class of merchants, the demand for these kind of display goods as a set of sort of status would increase as well, meaning more production, more styles, more techniques, and changing markets with changing attitudes over the course of the Edo period, which lasted until 1868, over 200 years. But also, Arita ware and other fine porcelains would be the largest export of Japanese ceramics into the greater world. See, I said semi-isolationism because the port of Nagasaki would be allowed to trade with the Dutch, although every European traded there, they just would raise a Dutch flag to sneak in. All of that porcelain that Japan was exporting over the course of the Edo period was predominantly Arita ware, or other Korean-inspired porcelains that were produced in Kyushu, where the majority of those Korean artisans had ended up. Over the course of those near 300 years, of course, the Koreanness of these populations would generally diminish, except for a few outliers. They would marry into Japanese families, they would take Japanese names, and over the generations, the kind of Korean identity would be erased. And what's particularly interesting about that is that the dynamic that would then come with the introduction of the European market. See, many of these Europeans in this period had a kind of Orientalism, a fascination with Asian art forms, both Chinese and Japanese. And the Qing dynasty was very restrictive on its trade exports, as were the Koreans, being a sort of tributary of the Qing. So Japan was able to fill a lot of that void in demand for the Europeans. Europe had tried to copy porcelain for a very long time and not done a great job. Delft being a good example of a not-so-great copy of porcelain of Chinese origin. But some of the earliest successful true china that Europeans made in 1709 was likely directly inspired from Arita ware, imported from Japan. So some of the most influential porcelain designs within Europe were likely originally Korean. The European market's hunger for Japanese art is still true to this day. And a lot of these very early and most influential pieces of porcelain on the production of European porcelains coming from Japan meant that it was often associated with Japan, and the Koreanness of that art was erased. This kind of European china became a new sort of conspicuous consumption, a new market of people who were using ceramics as a means of displaying their status. Things like a set of china would be a gift at a wedding. Having a plate displayed would become a weird sort of fixation of Victorians. And even into the 20th century, many Europeans would continue to use ceramics as a sort of artistic display of wealth and culture and status. Japanese artists would fill that export market quite well. China obviously did not have a great time in the 19th and 20th centuries, So Japan, enjoying a period of relative peace and then modernization, would have the opportunity to enter the artistic world in a very influential moment that diminished the contributions of those Korean artists into its own design. There's a kind of irony that Japan, which had only been making porcelain for 100 years maybe, when their art was copied by Europeans, was being granted such an elevated status within the broader art world compared to Chinese porcelain, which had probably been produced for, almost 1,000 years at that point, or the Korean artisans who had actually been the ones to make that porcelain and bring those designs and techniques into Japan. Obviously, the history between Japan and Korea is messy, so I'm sure it's quite controversial to draw so much attention to Japanese art forms invented by Koreans, but this story has been so erased, and I know for myself, coming from a Western audience, Japanese art is quite well represented in the Western world, but Korean art only very recently has started to enter the kind of public awareness. What I think this kind of history shows is how integrated and influential some of these cultural connections can be. And it draws into attention that even a period like the Edo period, where we so much associate Japan as focusing inward and as a kind of golden age of Japanese culture, was still very much affected by their exposure to other cultures, in this case in particular, Korean culture. Korean ceramics are world-renowned. Korean potters are very skilled and very well known, so I'm sure they don't need me to prop them up. But there is something unfortunate about this kind of historical erasure, because while so much of these ceramics and porcelains are beautiful and the influence that they've had over global ceramics is great, they carry with them a very traumatic tale of a people who were in the midst of brutal war and famine, stolen from their homes, brought to a hostile land, and forced, for all intents and purpose, to use their skill and knowledge to enrich the very people that had desolated their own country. That should at least be remembered if we want to appreciate the beauty of these works. And with that somber note, I'm going to end off the video here. If you're interested to look into the subject more, I actually linked in the description below a website from the, weirdly enough, Autonomous University of Barcelona, which was kind of the impetus for me looking more into the subject. It has a great sort of overarching look at the pottery, the potters, and this history of Korean artists brought to Japan. So if you want to look more into it, definitely recommend that website. It's a very good sort of intro and summary and details, and has a great list of sources as well if you want to look further into it. Also, obviously, like, subscribe, comment, all that goes a really long way. And if you have any other suggestions for potentially underappreciated historical events, let me know. Happy to hear about various ideas you might have. This has been Ground Up History. I hope you'll check out some of the other videos linked now, probably, and I'll see you next time.